Okay, well, welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're with us and staying with us. I'm really delighted to be able to talk with Kim Knowles and Carrie about these remarkable films as they relate to work that's part of an ongoing involvement that they're considering related to an edited volume that they're working on together, but also considering the nature of these films in relationship to experimental cinema and ways of thinking about how these three different films are related to each other and how we can start thinking about putting things together in a number of different ways based on the different backgrounds. So Carrie Noland has taught in the French department at UC Irvine for many years, starting with poetry, and is quite a renowned scholar related to the gesture and dance, particularly with her recent book about Merce Cunningham, who she knew growing up in New York, oddly enough. And with Kim Knowles, her work on photochemical practice is so revelatory and interesting in terms of extending ways of thinking about avant-garde cinema and ways of conceiving of the work of cinema and film as a medium, along with her work on Man Ray. So what I thought we would do is start with Kim describing a little bit more about the choice of the three films and its relationship to how she's presented them in the past, just to give us a clearer context for how they're shown and some of the issues that had come up in terms of how she was pairing them and related themes.
Yeah, all three of these films came to me. Well, I know the filmmakers of the last two films. I know them quite well, and I screened both of those films at Edinburgh, and I actually discovered Blua by chance through the submissions process, and it's not, unlike the last two films, it's not particularly well known on the experimental film scene, and I have been fascinated with that film since I saw it in 2015. And I have to say that my curatorial practice has been central for me in my research and my writing. So a lot of the filmmakers that I write about and the films that I'm analysing and the ideas that I come up with are, through encounters at the Edinburgh Film Festival. So. Yeah, I mean, it's been a number of years that I've been thinking about the representation of environmental issues, ecology, and that film, Blua, just really planted a seed for me. And then I've presented them in different contexts, in different combinations over the past few years. And I guess what's interesting for me in all of those films is this idea of, I mean, of course, as you see in the films, we're not just looking at, nice multi-species interactions. We're looking at all different forms of human, non-human, well, not all, but a kind of spectrum of different ways in which humans and non-humans interact, or the way that we are actually intricately tied to animals in different ways as pets, as sort of a resource for science, and there's a nice tension in all of those films between control and care. I mean, I think even those procedures that are carried out with the mouse, they're violent, but the intricate placing of the body on this mini operating table, it's very carefully You know, the mouse is very carefully laid out. And I feel that the filmmaking itself, the techniques that are being used in that film, is sort of about an aesthetics of care. You know, the filmmaker's asking us to be aware of the body, to feel the body. And that's why it's so uncomfortable, because we're so close. We're asked to almost touch the body of the mouse. So whilst there's this awful sense of control and vulnerability, there's also in the filmmaking style, I think, an aspect of care. And I think this control and care runs throughout all of those films. And then, you know, of course, there's the shifting between abstract, and in all of the films there's a shifting between abstraction and figuration. There's always moments in the films where the filmmaker draws away from figurative representation and takes us into a space of sort of, you know, embodied sensorial reflection. And so for me, those are the interconnections between those films, even though they're all doing very different things. And then there's the gaze. In all of the films, you have the eyes of the animal, and we constantly meet the eyes, and sometimes the gaze is very explicitly staged, and sometimes it's a little bit more subtle, but the eyes are very present. And of course, you know, we know how powerful images of eyes are in cinema. I mean, if anyone's ever seen Louis Buñuel's Anja and this eye-slicing sequence, you know, we all know how powerful and visceral that image of the eye can be. I mean, Man Ray knew it as well.
But picking up on figuration and gesture, we were talking a little bit earlier about different themes, Carrie, that you have been reading into some of the films, and also themes that relate to some of your ongoing work in terms of movement and gesture, particularly in The Masked Monkeys, in the third film that we watched, in terms of how the monkey is being presented, and the extent to which there's a quality of improvisation, structure, culture, nature that's involved with that. And I was wondering, how are you conceiving of that, or thinking of the movement, or the movement of the animal, you know, and is it a form of control culture? How are you looking at it?
Well, yeah, we were talking earlier about the fact that I approach these films as a dance and movement scholar, and so it's hard for me to think about them except in terms of the movement of the animal on the screen. And I can give you a couple of things that came to me just watching them this third time tonight, which is that there's a questioning, it seems to me, in the film about animal gestures and human gestures, and as forms of communication, as forms of behavior, but also as forms of communication. So, for instance, with respect to communication, in the first film, in Blua, it's really remarkable in the scene when the tiger is walking back and forth, and you have the frame of the vitrine of the zoo, and then you have the camera frame, and then you have the kind of opaque, scratched, or you know, some kind of viscosity on the surface of the glass, and then you pan over to the moving tiger. So there's a lot of frames around the movement of the tiger, and the first words that are uttered in that episode are, "Can you make him stand?" They're trying to get the tiger to stand up. So the boy, yes, he does the thing about carne and showing his chest, but he also, is reaching up, and at one point the tiger does reach up. And so it's a really strange moment in the film because you don't know if standing up is is understood by the tiger physically in the same way as standing up is understood by the people who are observing him, but there is an understanding of there's an interpretation on the part of the humans of the behavior of the tiger. There's a kind of empathy that's going on there. Standing up means something for both bodies. And then to give you another example, the dancer with the deer. We can, as a dancer, I can really predict the kind of movement that the human body is going to do, but it's hard for me to predict the movement of the deer. And the deer's movement has a different pace, it has a different tonicity. The deer moves in a very fast, sudden way as opposed to the dancer that's very fluid in most of the scene. And you notice that she goes on all fours. And that echoes an earlier scene when there's the deer on the upper screen and the upside down woman who's also on all fours. And it's as if she were advancing a paw. So the film seems to be playing with the similarity in gestures, the imitation in gestures, make him stand up, have him imitate me. There's a real echo effect. And then finally, just, I don't know if you guys noticed, but the first words of the last film, The Masked Monkey, are, "It all begins with the hands." We first see the hand, right? What defines primates? The opposable thumb, and the more evolved form, in quotes, of the human hand. And then the first time we see the monkey is the monkey's hand that's reaching over the door of the cage. So I see these films. I don't know what to do with the mouse. That I really, it's like, don't ask me about the mouse. But I do see this questioning of similarity versus difference, communication versus opacity of communication, and lack of transparency. I think that's what's going on for me.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the hands, because that opening sequence, I'm thinking about a scholar called Erin Branigan, who she works on dance and film, and isn't there a section in her work where she's talking about the hands, the expressivity of hands, and hands are quite a kind of common object in experimental cinema. But at the beginning of the film, we have this really beautiful. I mean, that's what the voiceover is talking about, the choreography of the hand, and it's actually very, very gentle and in comparison with the violence of this control over these.
Well, that's interesting that you bring up Erin Branigan's work, because one of the things that she's really interested in is the interface between cinema and performance. And she kind of is engaged in that paradigm around screen dance that's been a little bit more broadly worked out by a number of other people. But what's so interesting about her work is going in and out of the space of performance through film, that there's almost this means by which film functions in these different ways relative to performance. So is it a document of performance? Is it an expression in its own manner, given the formal properties of film? And going back to Laborat, one of the fascinating elements of that is that in so many ways it's a research film. And I've seen a number of research films. They're genres of a sort that are specialized, such that they're really part of the research process. So the manner in which this film is basically turning it into an experimental film of sorts is very interesting, because it's remaking the intention of how the film was originally shot, which is really about measuring the effects of whatever kind of fluid is being injected into the mouse to determine weight and effects that they're able to measure. But then it's turned into something else altogether, thanks to the score, thanks to the coloration, whether it's done with a printer after the fact or digitally. It turns it into some other kind of aesthetic experience that's powerful in many ways. But I was interested, Kim, I mean, being that you've seen the film a number of times, what do you think the major questions are that the film is asking us?
I mean, for me, the more I see the film, the more I see it as, well, I mean, like the last film, Masked Monkeys, it's drawing attention to documentary conventions in order to break them. And one of the things that I'm endlessly interested in is the way that experimental and documentary come together as, genres, if we can call experimental film a genre. And, pushing the boundaries of what we understand as documentary film. What is documentary? How do we define it, and how can we redefine it? And so I really feel like those two films are redefining the documentary genre. But then it's also laying bare the instruments of documentary, which is, rare. Of course, Jean Rouch did it with Chronicle of a Summer, but it's generally, it remains quite rare, doesn't it, that documentary filmmakers draw attention to that extent to the filmmaking processes. So it seems to me that they're in some way paralleling the precision and the processes, the very methodical way in which the procedure is taking place. That's mirrored in the documenting of the filmmaking itself. But I think, on a broader level, it's a film that really wants us to have a physical experience of this process. It's hard to watch. And it's hard to watch for I mean, we were talking about this in terms of empathy, right? Kind of visual empathy. It's hard to watch because of the proximity, the way that we're drawn into that really close relationship with the body of the mouse and the skin. At some point, the close-up is so close. I mean, they're using macro photography. It could be any skin. At some point, the skin fills the screen, I think. And it resembles human skin in a way. It could be, the origin of the skin starts to fall away, and we see that emphasis on, we are all one and the same.
Right.
We are, there's something that draws us all together, we are kind of the earth. And I think the filmmakers are wanting to draw attention to that, whilst also resisting any kind of commentary, resisting taking up any kind of position in relation to the ethics of what's happening. So it's quite unusual in a film in that it's showing us something really very, very difficult and uncomfortable, but doesn't take up a position in relation to it. I mean, it's like, this is what happens.
Well, what I'm wondering about also related to the comments you've both been making is the issue of whether or not staging animals through cinema or in this cinematic kind of context of experimental film is making them actually more human than the human agents that are enabling it. So there's a kind of reversal that's being staged as well in the process of making films about these animals as being either dreamlike, as with Blua, agents of a performance in Masked Monkeys, or the experimental mouse, for example. I mean, in a sense, they're in this subjected position to some extent in all three films, and then the extent to which there's a kind of idea about, the condition of subjugation to some extent that's being represented that makes them more human, more of a site for sympathy than the human agents themselves who are staging all of this, who are sort of invisible in the process.
Well, are they, I mean, in a certain sense, you could say that the trainers in Max Monkey are in a relationship to the animals that, say, directors or cinematographers are to actors. I mean, there's the performer is being manipulated, right, which is a kind of meta-commentary on cinematic relationships. But, I mean, I just think of that scene that I was talking to you about where the monkey is having his or her or their arms pinned behind them like this by a kind of a, I don't know, it's like a rod or something, and they're being pinned, and you see the expression on the face of and that's a scene of subjugation introduced as disciplining.
And creating the performance or the performer.
And you're saying that's humanizing of the animal, of the monkey?
Well, the idea of how the animals are being positioned and framed is in a sense putting them at the center of what the films are about to a large extent. So, by doing that, they're already, I don't know if I would call them protagonists, but they're figures. They're not characters either. They don't necessarily have they're not like human actors in films or in narrative films, but they're in a position that, for which our attention is focused. And that's significant to the extent that we're trying to understand them, we're projecting onto them. And in that way, we are humanizing them if we start looking at them in that way. That's why the switch with Laborat is really fascinating, because we're shifting from a lab film into an experimental film that's opening up a different set of questions.
But it's interesting, this idea of the animal as an actor, because I think what's fascinating about that sequence in Blua where the woman is talking to the dog is that we don't find many instances in film where an animal is playing a role unless it's like unless that the character of the animal is at the center of the film anyway. So the film, I mean, I can't think of any examples. I can only think of what's Lassie and
Lassie
Bambi, and the animated films, but also non-animated films, where the film is centered around the story of an animal. Okay, that's one thing,
sure.
And then. And then you've got the humorous animation like Ratatouille or, Finding Nemo. I mean, it's rare that we see an animal placed on the same level as a human. Is that humanizing? I mean, it's difficult. It's really difficult terrain to navigate, isn't it? But both... the dog and the human occupy a sort of equal proportions of the frame. And, also talking about hands, there is this moment, quite beautiful, where you have the hands of the woman and the paws of the dog. It's possible to sort of idealize that and say, well, that's surely not all we need in order to revolutionize kind of cinematic representations of animals, is it? Just to kind of put them in the same frame. But I think there's something quite interesting going on there about how we might represent animals on screen.
Another feature of the films and experimental cinema in general has to do with format. Whether filmmakers who are using Super 8, 16 millimeter, or more and more digital formats, which always seems to be the way in which they're projected. And there's always this issue about the body of the film, the ways in which the film itself is being manipulated, beyond the image that's been photographed. And I thought what was interesting, Laborat is a good example of that in terms of post-production ways in which to manipulate the film. But I think more generally, talking about experimental cinema, do you see any of these films as examples of types of films that are being made? Are they part of a subgenre in a way, in terms of what makers are interested in now?
I think one of the things that's really, well, there's two things going on here. There's the way that 16 millimeter is being used, despite people thinking that films only are made in digital now. So that on the one hand you have people that are persisting with that medium, like Guillaume, Cailleau, Laborat is made entirely on 16 millimeter. But then there's a lot of interesting work happening with film, and where film and digital come together, that hybrid mode of making films. But then there's also something really interesting happening around documentary. I feel like documentary is something, somewhere to look in experimental film, contemporary experimental film aesthetics. The way that the boundaries are constantly being pushed, and the use of fictionalization as well, bringing together fiction and non-fiction within the same film, so that you're really walking a tightrope all the time, wondering what's going on here. Is this fiction, non-fiction? I think the act of killing kind of brought that into a more mainstream, not mainstream, but feature length context.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a similar kind of thing. I mean, you have Leviathan as well, from the Sensory Ethnography Lab. The documentary is fascinating when you bring it into contact with experimental cinema, because then it just becomes like, wow, I say to my students, you think documentary is boring, I'll show you some stuff that you won't be bored by.
Well, it is an interesting point that you're making about the transformation of documentary techniques or styles that are, in a sense, being transformed. And one thing I was thinking about a lot with all three films is the soundtrack, or whether it was an experimental soundtrack that was commissioned, like with Laborat, and also with Blua. There's a kind of attention to the sound. And then in the third film, Masked Monkey, this voiceover narration, which is always the sort of vanishing point for a certain style of documentary filmmaking. The voice, the precision of the voice, the manner in which action on the screen is being described, context is being filled in. That I thought was a very interesting way in which to work with these kinds of elements that are sort of being repurposed. Is that part of the thinking with regard to documentary cinema as being a kind of basis for experimentation and transformation in this relationship to a kind of idea of reality?
It's fascinating, because I have a tendency to overlook sound in the way that I write about films, but it's kind of, it's impossible to ignore in those three films, isn't it? And I wonder to what extent our difficulty with watching Laborat is to do with the sound. There's something about the sound of the cutting, which makes it much more visceral. And it's the same in Masked Monkeys with the strobe section. It's the sound, the repetition of sound that takes us to a particular place. And it's a similar thing going on at the beginning of Blua, where you have this breath, the breath of the dog, and I guess that takes us back to the breath, the breathing, the beating heart of the mouse in Laborat that you mentioned. That what makes it so hard to watch is that there's a breath. This thing is alive. There's a breath, and I think breath in cinema. Wow, isn't that kind of understudied as well?
The dog is breathing too, and the scene with the almost strobe effect at the beginning. I wanted to go back to something you were saying before about the humanizing, because I think one of the things in the paper that you're writing that you weren't able to present here, but that I've heard twice, that you were trying to trouble is this distinction between humanizing and animalizing, or being a human and being an animal. I think one of the things that Blua does that's really interesting is in the fiction part, when the mother says, "I was a crocodile," she's sitting there, and in that dialogue, her monologue, her short monologue, she is blurring the boundaries, and the son's face expresses our incredulity, but there's asking the question of whether the animal is being humanized, if the trainers are becoming beasts. It doesn't seem to me the right question, because I think the films themselves are working towards blurring that boundary. Why are there so many shots of hands and claws and paws? There's also the bear's, we see the bottom of the bear's paw that looks a lot like the scaliness, kind of the leatheriness of the tortoise coming out of its shell, or there's this playing about on surfaces. The mother's hand has almost a kind of a leathery look to it. And I don't read the films as trying to humanize the animals, even though that you could say that saying that the dog was in your belly is, is either humanizing or it's getting rid of the boundary. It's playing with that.
But I see that as a much more complex, not so much a metaphor, but a suggestion of a way of thinking about the interconnected nature of all things. We do have non-humans inside us. We are inhabited by non-human forms. So we have all this. We have stuff inside us. So she's not going to give birth to a dog, but there's something going on there, I think, that is trying to express the inexpressible, and it's not as simple as a metaphor, is it? But it's an invitation, I think, to a way of thinking.
Well, why don't we open it up for questions? How would that be? We'd love to hear from you and to hear your reflections about the films and the discussion that we're having about them.
I couldn't help but think about Étienne Jules Marie and the way he sort of strapped on a sort of string with a camera photograph of some sort to record the movements of birds. And it seems to me maybe there's this way of sensing the worlds of animals by detection that in itself could be one of control. And something that I am thinking about right now, especially with Laborat, is this relationship with proximity and empathy. And I'm wondering in what ways could proximity lends itself to an effective empathy with these creatures, but one that's sort of not dependent on a gaze either. Because actually I felt as if looking at the rat's eyes, I didn't really, its eyes were so bloodshot red compared to the gaze of like a donkey or of a dog. And so I felt that my empathy towards a rat was more of a different type of proximity. So I'm sort of wondering, in a way, has cinema privileged too much the eye with regard to animals, if so much of its early development especially was that of the eye, the animal, and tracking movement?
I mean, one thing I could say related to the work of Etienne Jules Marais, the early filmmaker whose work sort of evolved from glass plate photography or dry plate photography into moving image photography, is the idea that it was part of a development related to measurement of movement in time. And with this experimental format, one of the things that starts to change and evolve is thinking about how to upend certain kinds of conventions of how we see things. So the modernity of early inventions associated with moving images was really about how do you represent movement in time. And with experimental cinema, one of the things that you're addressing most often is the issue of how does the sort of established machine, apparatus, institution, in a sense enable these different means by which to show things and represent things and open up these new kinds of questions of how do you interrupt, how do you ask different kinds of questions, which I think is one of the things that's happening with, all of these films in different ways, leading us to ask different questions than we would otherwise, as opposed to the establishment of the institution, the apparatus, the manner in which to show movement as a grounding basis to think about what is it? What is this means of doing it?
But just to play devil's advocate, because I think your question is fabulous, it could be argued that not much has changed because if you this last scene in Blua, where the bird is being held by its feet and flapping its wings, and you see this unbelievably shapely, tonic muscularity of the bird's torso as it's flapping its wings. You see the muscles rippling. We're still fascinated with the filming of movement. And calculating measurement of movement is a cross-species quantifier. I mean, you use the same calculus to, like, what do I know about calculus? But you use the same measuring tools to measure the movement and the tempo of the movement of an animal as you would for a human animal, right? So I think, first of all, that kind of gaze on movement is one that levels different types of living and non-living things, anything that moves, because it all can be measured by the same instruments. But also did wonder, watching that scene with the bird, whether we've moved so far from Marais, actually, because the fascination with the body's muscles is still really present.
But that sequence is also about, it's a highly mediated, I mean, of course, all the films are mediated, right? But that is, that's using I think it's 500 frames per second.
Camera is that?
Yeah. So it's I think it's actually 7 seconds of footage that's stretched out to a few minutes. So that's also I think that sequence is also about a kind of fascination with using technology to break movement down. She told me that she was interested in like seeing how a bird moves, how the wings move, and but yeah, I mean there is also I'm speaking about empathy. It's that containment. I mean, I think containment is so key to all of those films. That restriction of movement, it comes across to me as it's quite violent. Arresting movement in that way by not allowing the bird to take off, to do what feels natural, and that's like the containment. I mean, it actually makes me feel quite breathless, when I see the
monkeys,
the chain around the neck, and then the vulnerability of the mouse. I mean, this shot with the paws, or the feet in the air. I mean, there's just something so profound about that, but also so simple. That vulnerability that you spoke about, I think, when we were discussing the film at some point. You said that what you found difficult was that sort of the vulnerability of that thing, that small being, that is still alive, it's alive.
Thank you so much. I thought maybe we could end the evening with something slightly more lighthearted, and I was just going to ask about kind of the affective palette of experimental cinema, and these moments in all three films actually had humorous moments, even Laborat. I don't know if anyone else wanted to giggle when this tiny MRI was unveiled, but I really wanted to laugh. And it kind of was like a leveling moment, and I thought that was actually really interesting. And so if you could speak to, I guess, other audiences' reactions or other films that might play with this and I think also to speak to the movement and gesture, there are some films where the humor was actually coming from the gestural, like the masked monkeys and the grooming scene at the end, and others where it was coming from the text or the narrative. So
I think people sort of tend to forget that experimental cinema is also funny. Like I say to my students, it's funny, you can laugh, they kind of think they're afraid to laugh because they think that it's not appropriate with experimental film. I mean, experimental film is playful as well, and it's about like having an openness, a sort of radical openness that allows for an openness, a fluidness of thought. And often that does involve humor, whether it's intentional or not. And I think, humor is a way of bringing someone closer, isn't it? And I think that, there are lots of, I think, unintentional moments of humor in Laborat. Like the bit that always makes me chuckle is, and it's not funny at all actually, but it's where one of the mice is taken out of the cage, and the other one sort of, pops its head out really briefly and then goes scurrying back in. And why is that funny to me? I don't know.
I just had this really weird juxtaposition of, doesn't the lion in the MGM like come out of a hole?
Oh yeah.
And in the beginning, the first shot of Laborat is the rat. I think it's a mouse. I don't know.
It's a mouse.
But
it's a
the
mouse, yeah.
sticking its face out. It's out of the hole. That's such a strange thought that, the MGM rat. Yeah.
We've been talking in some of the other presentations about a film called La Vache qui rumine, so the cow that ruminates. It's a really small film from 1969, and it basically just shows a cow chewing and then occasionally looking at the camera. And I've been really fascinated with how that elicits laughter in the audience, why, what's, you know, and that is about gesture. It's about a kind of, you know, the meeting the gaze of who, the filmmaker, the camera, I don't know, but, you know, there are certain animals do things that we find funny. Why is that? Like, why, what is it about animal gesture, movement?
Well, isn't it when they're most like us? I mean, isn't the, you know, monkeying, right? Singer in French means to imitate. You know, to be a monkey is to imitate. And maybe that's, you know, you asked about the grooming, you know, isn't that the most humanoid kind of moment? Well, I don't know, there's a lot of behaviors of that monkey that are, to me, very legible, and I could be completely misconstruing the gestures and the expressions, the facial expressions of the monkey, but they're, certainly I think laughter is linked to seeing animals do something that looks like something a human would do. And I don't know if you agree, that just seems to be where a lot of animal humor comes from.
Great. So why don't we leave it at that? Thank you so much, Kim and Carrie, and for bringing these marvelous films.
Thank you.